Mrs. Rebecca Gookool-Bosland. This is our third year in hosting this event together with the Shaw Foundation and the Rotary Club of Pointe-a-Pierre. We are very grateful to have our very own Dr. Roger Hussein, who is our Rotarian from the Pointe-a-Pierre Rotary Club, and his esteemed colleagues tonight, which will be on our guests on our panel tonight, Mr. Mariano Brown and Mr. Kevin Ramnarine. We do look forward tonight to hearing their fair and balanced contributions to the micro and macroeconomic plans laid out in this year's fiscal budget, 2020 to 2021. Thank you. I now hand over to Mrs. Gookool. Thank you.
Davidson, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as per our conversations, may I remind you that you should keep your microphone muted, and this is to ensure that we do not have feedback. This is also to let you know that our conversations this afternoon, and if it is that you've ever been part of any of our sessions, it's really about ensuring that there is an organic discussion on the key issues. On October 5th, 2020, which is or was, as a matter of fact, 10 days ago, the National Budget 2021 was read in the Parliament by our esteemed Minister of Finance. Since then, there's been a battery of conversations in the public media as to the potential implications, as to what it means for the man on the street. I would like to invite everyone to engage directly with our panelists. At the end of all of the questions, at the end of all of the presentations, we will have an opportunity to chat with the experts in terms of what their position is regarding the expectations, what their positions are in terms of what we are likely to see in the economy unfolding over the next couple of years. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Roger Hussein to share his screen and give him the floor for the presentation. Just letting you know as well, ladies and gentlemen, that the session is being recorded as a matter of records for our institutions, and it is also being live streamed to our YouTube page. So Dr. Hussein, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and good evening all. Rebecca, you have to allow me to share my screen. It's saying host disabled participant.
Sure, Dr. Hussein, let me
Okay, I think I've gotten through here now. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening all, and it's good to be at a Rotary Show
Dr.
event.
Hussein, please put it on presentation view. That might help our viewers. I
will do that. I'm just talking for a moment. It's good to be here at a Rotary Show event. I have one foot in each corridor, and sometimes it gets stretched a little wide, but it's all for the cause of community. It's always a tremendous pleasure to work and to engage with Rotary and with my Shaw Foundation folks. We do quite a bit of activity together. The COVID has slowed us down. The only thing we really were able to do this year was some seedlings giveaway. But we now have this budget function, and God is good. As we go along, we are going to return to activities in the corridors of humanity where we could add value. So thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to share my PowerPoint now and actually start the conversation. So Rebecca, it's on full screen now, right?
Yes, Dr. Hussein, please proceed.
All right. Before speaking, I see quite a few students on. Welcome, students, and it's a pleasure to have you all as well. Okay, so, I looked at this budget that was presented. By the way, folks, Mariano told me he would be a few minutes late and his camera isn't working. So, Rebecca, you may have to call him in a few minutes' time to see how that goes, please.
I already did, Dr. Hussein, and we're working it out.
Okay, thanks. Now, we just had the, as Rebecca said, the 2021 budget being read. And, you know, we are in a pandemic and we have to bat very carefully to come out of this pandemic. And the minister and the government, they made some strides. And I commend them for the effort in this trying time period to move the ball forward. So what has left me a little concerned with the budget is where would the fiscal measures eventually take us? Will it take us to a stronger position or a weaker position? And if you all read yesterday's Express, I had a long conversation with the public on what the fiscal measures would do for growth. So Imwood said, resetting the economy for growth and innovation. And you know, there were quite a few students on the conversation, and I asked for what growth. You know, you could grow into a better place in life. You could grow into a worse place in life. You could grow with a stronger investment behind you. You could grow with weaker investment behind you. And I wonder what type of growth did he have in mind? And I spent a lot of time thinking about this economy. I think I know this economy as good as anybody else in the world. There are quite a number of problems. The level of GDP has fallen in the recent past by about 18%. Debt per capita GDP is on the increase. The primary balance as a percent of GDP remains persistently negative. The balance of payment in recent times has been persistently in deficit. And a host of problems here that I mentioned that we could elaborate on in the question and answer session. So to explain this in greater detail, and I am assuming nobody here understands economics, so don't just watch the graph, you don't have to understand the graph, but there are quite a few students on, so I hope that they follow. Let the economy be at the point A in March 2020. And then came COVID-19 in Trinidad. So we had to close down the entertainment sector. And we would hear people say that there are 100,000 people working in the entertainment sector. So that's a significant blow. That's 1/6 of your workforce. And then all the people in the little hardware and groceries and whatnot that are not getting 6 days work, they are now getting 5 or 4, and we are trying to make life work. So the whole economy is in a trying position. So the economy moves inward at a lower level of production to point B. So I'm going to ask President, President Davidson, am I making sense so far?
Yeah, most certainly. This is especially the manufacturing sector.
Right.
We have, yeah.
So I'm speaking in a way that people who didn't do economics would understand this thing. But I know you all are in business and whatnot, so you all would likely understand it. And I'm speaking in that regard. So we are at point B. So things bad, we are operating within our production capability. The government on October the 5th, 2020, had the task to paint a roadmap to take this economy forward. They could do a number of things. They could take the economy back to point A, and certainly I would love to go back to point A. I would love to go and see a movie, and I would love to go and eat a nice movie, see a nice movie, and sit down in Starbucks and Rituals and drink a nice cup of hot chocolate. Those days are gone for the moment. In fact, and those days will be difficult to return. And every time you sit down and somebody sneezes, you wonder if it's a death sentence and so on and so on. Now, you could also take the economy to a point like C. And C is a point where, yes, you open back the economy and you produce more goods, but you produce more non-tradable goods. So you engage in more construction, you engage in more malls and more things like that, and you therefore go to a point such as C. Or you could go to a point such as D, where you open up the economy again and you produce more, but you produce more tradable goods, more oil and gas, more cocoa, more pimentos, more scorpion pepper, more garments to export, more export-oriented items, and less non-tradable items, especially non-essential non-tradables. And whenever I say this, I always tease you back a little bit and say, so less pretty handbags, less nice high-heel shoes, you could buff me after, and more tradable goods. So that's another option. So I personally think, and because of the decline in the stock of reserves, that we should go to a point as D and not to a point as COE. So let's see what was proposed. Now, the government proposed several fiscal measures. The property tax. The property tax is a good thing. If it is, we use the money from the property tax to maintain the communities and to fix the processes involved with garbage collections and whatnot. I don't know that that would be done, but I give the government credit that that could be done. Revenue Authority will take us back to point A, and dependent upon how government spends the extra revenue, we could go to C to D. Again, I will give the government the benefit of the doubt. Tax incentives for construction. Now, this is where we have to be careful. And I think the tax incentive for construction, as well as the stamp duty, could lead to greater employment, which is good, could lead to greater output, which is good, but could lead to problems with foreign exchange, which is bad. And my hypothesis is that we need to create employment and we need to create output whilst we are generating more foreign exchange, or towards the end of generating more foreign exchange. And that's where I think the budget 2021 made a few errors in my judgment. I notice many people are saying the budget is quite good, and I am happy to see that. I prefer to be wrong and the majority right, but this is my case. The tourism accommodation upgrade is very good, provided we could actually get people to want to travel. The removal of VAT on technology is good, and it creates more opportunities in the economy. The VAT on luxury food items is very good. They should have done this since 2005, and it's an issue in the economy, but it's a good situation for us to impose this VAT. The motor vehicle tax concession, I think it's a very good thing, and we should stick to this for the next 5 years. Save on for when we are poor. This country is poor. We don't have money. Let's live within our means. The public-private partnership is something, it's a fancy term and it's something we've been saying a long time. But how do we know that the public-private partnerships will take us to a point of less import distribution? Freezing public sector employment is good. We just simply don't have the money. Small and medium-sized enterprise and stock exchange intervention. But how do we know that the firms that would be supported won't be firms that would be foreign exchange users? Wear and tear allowances. How do we know? Or why didn't we intervene and make the wear and tear allowances for firms that are producing export revenues in a greater way? And so on. So the best intervention in the budget was the specialized economic zone to replace free zones, in my judgment, and the SPT, the reduction of the SPT, and Kevin will speak more on that. The workforce recovery program was good, but I don't know that that will reduce the amount of people that are dropping out of the labor force. That's the challenge I have. And privatizing the port is good. I hope it's not just a lot of old talk. Raising the retirement age to 65 is good. I hope it's not just old talk. But when I listen to the budget, we say all of these things. Agricultural stimulus, 500 million. But how can you run an agricultural stimulus and expect the agricultural sector to grow and simultaneously spend 400 million on CPEP. Each one is pulling in opposite directions. So in closing, I would say that there are several areas in which the budget needs to be tougher. We need to talk about the Venezuelan migrants. It makes no sense to have 33 to 100,000 Venezuelan migrants here, or let's say 75,000, and you do not engage them in a meaningful way. And if you leave it as is, and I will get back to this later on, especially when Mariano comes on, if he comments on it, because we have views on this together and differently. It makes no sense to have Venezuelan migrant workers here and let them be a foreign exchange chain on the economy. This is not a system in which we could just give away our foreign exchange. We have to be symbiotic. I suspect there was a comment in the Guardian today, I didn't see it myself, on the NIZIT, and we need to bring the National Statistical Institute of Trinidad and Tobago on board. GATE, there was no comment on GATE, but we can't afford it. There was one comment on the labor force participation rate that ignores the non-institutionalized population, no comment on CPEP in terms of reforming. The debt to me, when I worked it out, was closer to the 90s than the 80s, and absolutely no comment on fiscal responsibility legislation and the formation of a fiscal council to manage debt and to manage the size of the fiscal deficit. So I come back to this situation here. I am of the view that the budget will take us closer to point C as compared to point D. D is a point of greater foreign exchange production via greater production of tradable goods. And we therefore have, while we are adjusting and creating more employment and jobs, to create foreign exchange. So I will stop there, and I would go back to some of these points in the question and answer session. So thank you very much, Rebecca and Davidson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein, for that insight into this evening's presentation. I will now like to, it will be my great pleasure to invite Mr. Kevin Ramnarine. He was the former Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago from June 2011 to September 2015. From May 2010 to 2011, he served as a Parliament Secretary in the Ministry of Energy and Energy Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago. And he is currently a lecturer at the Arthur Luck Jack School of Business in Trinidad and Tobago and an energy consultant. So I would now like to present Mr. Kevin Ramnaray. Thank you.
Hi, good night, everybody, and good night to the Rotary Club of Pointe-a-Pierre. I have a couple slides I would like to share. So I'm hoping that the screen share is working for me. So let me try that. Yes, it is working. So let me just, so you're seeing that? Everybody seeing that?
Yes, we are
Rebecca,
seeing that,
right?
Mr.
Okay,
Ramnarine. Go ahead.
All right, so I'll use this graph to begin as my starting point, right? What?
Can you put it on presentation view, please?
Sure. Right, better?
Much, thank you.
Okay, so at the end of the day, when all is said and done, Trinidad and Tobago has to earn US dollars to keep this economy ticking along and to support our standard of living, which is the highest in the Caribbean. So we need to earn US dollars, and we have not been earning US dollars at the rates that we used to earn US dollars, let's say 6 or 7 years ago. So this graph speaks to real GDP, which is your blue line, and compares real GDP to hydrocarbon production, which is both oil and natural gas expressed as a single unit called barrels of oil equivalent per day. So if you look at the graph is for the period 2014 to 2020. because, you know, as a former, I'd like to say a former politician, right? You always get accused of, people might say, why you start at 2015 for? Why didn't go back to early period, right? So I went back 1 year into 2014. So this shows a very close relationship, or what we like to say, a high positive correlation between hydrocarbon production, which is your orange line, and your real GDP, which is the value of all the goods and services produced in the economy. So you can see that the two lines follow each other pretty closely. If you look at the orange line, you would see an increase. You would see a gradual decrease from 2014 until 2016. Then you would see that it a gradual bump in 2017, 2018, and then it begins to go down again. So according to the latest review of the economy, our economy has contracted by about 16% in the last 5 years. That's 2015 to 2020. I saw something today on Facebook, and I didn't get time to really interrogate it, but I understand the Prime Minister gave a speech today to the Latin American Caribbean chapter of the American Chamber of Commerce. And he said that the economy would have contracted by 6.8% in 2020. So I've used the 6.8% for 2020. So the two lines are pretty much related, but you notice that for the year 2020, the distance between the two lines has widened. And that is because there is something else happening in the economy in 2020 other than a decline in hydrocarbon production, which has caused the blue line to deviate significantly away from the orange line. And of course, that other thing happening in the economy in 2020 is the impact of COVID-19 on Trinidad and Tobago's economy. So the moral of the story is that if we want to turn this economy around, and yes, we all support diversification. Diversification is not going to get that blue line to curve back upwards anytime soon. Diversification will probably have an impact in maybe 3, 4, 5 years, middle to the second half of this decade and so on. To get that blue line to curve back upwards, we have to get that orange line to begin to curve back upwards. And as you could see, the orange line has really been struggling from where it was in 2014. It's come down from somewhere in the region of 750,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day to where we are now. The orange line is somewhere about 630,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. It's a significant decline in both oil and natural gas production in this 6-year period. And the reasons for that are multifold, and they have nothing to do with a lack of oil and a lack of natural gas in Trinidad and Tobago. It has a lot to do with our policies. It has a lot to do with ease of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago, which is something which I'm happy, and I want to give Roger a lot of credit for this, because ease of doing business has now become a very popular buzz term. When you listen to ministers speak, or when you listen to chambers of commerce and so on, people have now really recognized its importance. But ease of doing business in Trinidad and Tobago is very challenging and needs to be improved. But I want to tell you that within the energy sector, it is even more difficult to do business because of the highly regulated nature of the sector. So in the budget, the minister proposed to change the supplemental petroleum tax regime to move what I call the trigger point for supplemental petroleum tax from $50 a barrel to $70 a barrel. And he decided to make that facility available for small oil producing companies on land. This is a good move. It should have happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but it is very welcome by the industry. And it is my opinion it is going to lead to a lot of a lot of companies which have been idle. It will lead to them. In fact, while I was setting up the meeting here, one of those small oil companies that they do about 300 barrels of oil per day, one of the owners of the company WhatsApped me. So it is a good move. I would have gone a step further and I would have made that facility available for the entire oil and gas industry, not just the small oil companies on land. Because if you really want to get this orange line to begin to curve upwards, you need to get the big players to increase their production. That's the BPs and the BHPs and so on, and the Perencos and so on. So it is a bit late, but it's welcome, and I think it's going to lead to a lot of activity on land in South Trinidad. The other issue, of course, is natural gas production, and of course the orange line is both oil and natural gas. So I haven't stripped out natural gas from that. They're both included in that orange line. When I left office in 2015, natural gas production was 3.8 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And I'll go back even further. In 2010, it was 4.3, which is our peak natural gas production, 2010. So it went from in 2010 from 4.3 billion cubic feet of gas per day. It came down to 3.8. 3.8 was still a bit tolerable, and Point Lisas could have, operated, albeit some plants are running at, 85% capacity or 90% capacity. It's now down to 3.2. So we've gone from 4.3 to 3.2 in a 10-year period. And that cannot be a good thing for Trinidad and Tobago, because what it means is that we now have a lot of idle industrial capital in this country. We have plants which are down in Point Lisas. The number changes because I think it's maybe 6 plants down right now. A couple plants came back up. We have the refinery down. That again is idle industrial capital. There are issues around Atlantic LNG has not been spared this decline in gas production. So we have to get natural gas production to turn upward and to do it on a sustainable basis. So critical to turning the economy around is getting oil and natural gas production back up. For that to happen, companies have to be incentivized to drill and to explore, and they also have to have the acreage that they need to explore and to drill and so on. So I expect natural gas production to remain in the doldrums in 2020 and 2021. And this is based on the information that was put into the budget this year. The minister gave a figure of 3.2 billion cubic feet of gas per day for 2020. And he said that that figure would be the same in 2021. However, in 2022, there are about 4 or 5 natural gas projects which come into production all around the same time. And I expect that in 2022, the orange line begins to curve up again. But the question is, how sustainable is that? Because we've seen from the 2017 and 2018 experience that that was not sustainable. So there is going to be some recovery in production in 2022. The other issue, which I will touch briefly on, which you may have been reading, of course, is Touchstone. Touchstone, and I think we need to mention this. Touchstone was awarded a block on the 31st of October, 2014. While I was minister, Touchstone was awarded the block. The acreage in southeastern Trinidad. So if you think about South Trinidad as 2 halves, southwestern and southeastern, the predecessor companies to Heritage Petroleum, like Petrotrin and whoever was there before Petrotrin, had not paid much attention to southeastern Trinidad. A lot of the focus on from Petrotrin was, in the southwestern part of South Trinidad. So in the ministry, we decided that we were going to give out acreage in that southeastern part of Trinidad. And one of the companies that got acreage, luckily for Trinidad, was Touchstone, a Canadian company. I invite anybody to look at the share price over the last 6 months. So Touchstone has now drilled 3 exploration wells in southeastern Trinidad, Coho, Cascadura, and Chinook, and they have all been successful. My information is that, and I don't like to give numbers, but my information is that the collective amount of discoveries thus far could be somewhere in the region of 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, significant volume of natural gas. Touchstone has the beauty, and Roger was pointing this out to me, the beauty of discovering natural gas on land is the speed with which you could get that into the pipeline network. So Touchstone is already preparing to monetize its gas in the 4th quarter of this year and in the first half of next year. So that's a good news story for Trinidad, and it shows what happens when companies explore. And I just want to mention one more thing which I find very impressive about Touchstone. If you visit Touchstone's offices, it's a Canadian-owned company, owned by Canadians. Of course, it's a Trinidad-registered company, but that company is run by, I would say, young citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So it hits home that our investment in things like the geoscience program at UE and the petroleum engineering degrees at UTT has paid a dividend for this country. Later on in the program, as we have the Q&A, I will talk about the issue which I know a lot of people want to talk about, which is the deregulation of the fuel industry in Trinidad and the privatization of NP. We could leave that for the open discussion. So I'll hand back over to Rebecca.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ramnarine. Enlightening as always. And we really appreciate that your conversations are coming from a place of experience. At this time, I want to hand over to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, you may share your screen if you have one. If not, you may go ahead to offer your presentation.
Right. Thank you very much. My problem, I have a video problem and a camera problem. So I apologize in terms of any presentation.
That's okay.
I also apologize to the audience for joining a little late and not hearing Roger and only picking up the tail end of Kevin. So I might be repeating a few things. I think the focus and I think the general perspective that we need to put on the table is where are we in terms of the world economy as we speak. And that is that COVID notwithstanding, the energy sector has been in an adjustment phase, and as a result of it, Trinidad has been in an adjustment phase as well. The position that we face today is no different to the position that we faced in 2015 at the changeover of government. We've run consistent budget deficits. The balance of payments is negative. Foreign exchange reserves are declining. And the official foreign exchange reserve at $7.2 billion does not take into consideration the fact that we've borrowed somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion over the period, as well as had drawdown from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund amounting to about another $1.5 billion to $2 billion. If you were to adjust the reserves for that, and you will call that free reserves, in other words, reserves net of payments or items which have to be repaid, and you take the debt into consideration, our real reserve position is about $5 billion. And that's the important point to note. The reserve position in real terms, adjusting for external debt gets you into trouble. Because if you don't have foreign exchange reserves, you can't pay external debt. You could always pay domestic debt by rescheduling and or reissuing new debt to replace the old debt. So let's just leave the TT dollar debt aside for the time being and focus on the US dollar borrowings. And if you take that into consideration, our reserves are considerably less than they were before. So if we started off with reserves at about 10.5 billion in September 2015, our real position is about 5 billion. Now, why the importance and why the focus on reserves? Because literally every business in Trinidad and Tobago depends on foreign exchange reserves, with the exception of those companies that are generating and are self-sufficient in terms of US dollars. So any business that is not self-sufficient in terms of US dollars literally has to depend upon the reserves that they get at the bank. So that means if, for example, you're in the retail and distributive sector, or if you're in some form of manufacturing, or in any kind of distribution exercise, it means that you depend on the commercial banking sector for reserves. And as you all know, that those are getting the sort of US dollar demand that you're looking for to maintain your sales, to maintain your business position, is a very difficult process as we speak. So every business is facing the likelihood that its revenue is going to decline because it doesn't have the US dollars to repurchase the same amount of stock as it did last year. Or you can't get access to the US dollars. Well, that's the reality. And that's the transmission mechanism for what we consider to be a declining position. Now, so that whatever we do moving forward really depends on our ability to generate foreign exchange. I think that's if there's one critical decision that has to be made, it is what do we do to increase the foreign exchange earnings. Now, as everybody knows, everybody who's been involved in business, mobilization, starting off with a new idea, starting off with a new business, invariably takes about 3 to 5 years to get your business on track. And in most occasions, what we are talking about is that you generally will start your business and run your business in the country of origin. In other words, you have a business in Trinidad and Tobago, you will do it in Trinidad and Tobago, and you will use your export market as a way of extending and or increasing your production run and bringing down your lower unit cost, and therefore allows you to export into other territories. So in the first instance, what you really need to do, if you're starting off anew and starting off with a new business idea, you really need to basically ensure that you have a good home base. And then when you've established yourself in your home base, you talk about exporting. Exporting has additional risks. And the additional risk, of course, comes with credit risk, the ability to repay, and a whole other set of risks in the sense of market competition where you're going to and everything else that follows from that. So that getting into new export markets is a 3 to 5 year experience if you're starting off anew. Right? And that means establishing your business in the domestic market. So that's the first point. And that's the important point that we need to focus on. Because in the budget, the budget we consider to be is a stimulus budget, insofar as it offers incentives to contractors to construct, to build. The state is going to essentially said that it's going to be increasing the number of housing units over a 10-year period, at least 2,500 houses a year. There are incentives in terms of respect of commercial construction. There are incentives with regard to those businesses to invest in the new digitization areas and a whole other set of stuff. And it also is running a deficit. And a deficit is by definition is expansionary. So you would say that the budget in a choice between austerity and expansion has chosen expansion. Is that going to make the economy grow? The answer to that is probably a little bit, but not by much. A deficit is expansionary, and we're talking about the size of the deficit is substantial. It's about $8 to $9 billion. That's on the projection. It could be worse, depending upon how the revenue situation plays itself out. So it recognizes the impact of COVID. And as a result of that, is attempting to bring some level of buoyancy to maintain internal demand. I think generally speaking, everybody has accepted that as a necessary cost, given where we are. And I think that there's been generally a sigh of relief that there's been no sort of austerity measures on the part of the government. Although the government has sent signals that WASA will have to change, and that by definition, what is also signaling, by focusing on WASA, what it is really telling the public is that we will probably have to pay more for water moving down the road. And they said the same thing with regard to electricity. And they've also signaled something similar with regard to the fuel situation. So in real terms, we can expect that individuals' household income will now have to spend more on utilities, but the time frame for that is at least somewhere around the next 9 months, because it's going to take a little while to get through the Regulated Industries Commission and the other things that have to happen. So suffice it to say that those changes are not going to come for at least another 9 months, but the signals have been sent that they will come. Similarly, we have had the signal with respect to motor vehicle taxation. The bottom line is government is looking for revenue. It could have raised VAT. It didn't. Unify the VAT rate at 15%. That's where we were before. It didn't. It could have unified the income tax rate. It didn't. Now, those two decisions are in arrears. If the situation continues in the way we are, the government cannot run deficits for a continuous period. At 80%, we're not that far away from moving upwards to literally, borrowing in a difficult area. In fact, the benchmark is 70. We're 10 percentage points over that, and we already have borrowings which are slated to take place during the course of the year. So the borrowing rate is likely to go up to 90%. So far, because of the strength of our reserves and the strength of the Heritage and Civilization Fund, in a sense, that gives you about a year or two to make the necessary adjustments. Hopefully that oil prices will change and go upwards, that gas prices will change and go upwards, and that the increases will be sufficient to restart the petrochemical sector. But that's a whole lot of assumptions. So we have to look at where we are. The reality is we've had budget deficits for 11 years. This is, the minister in the course of his presentation did indicate that the CSO had revised their number for 2018 to plus 0.2% away from minus 0.2%. That's a significant change. But when I looked at the IMF numbers today, the IMF numbers show all negative for the last 5 years. Of the last 7 years, we have 6 negative numbers with regard to GDP. They do have a projection of an increase for next year, somewhere in the region of about 2 percentage points. We'll see how that one works out. So where are we? Well, the phrase I used in an article a couple of weeks ago was treading water. That's what we're doing. We're treading water. There is the probability or the likelihood that there will be some changes in the energy sector. Kevin alluded to some of those. But is it going to be sufficient as to move for it to become a rising tide that will lift all boats? I don't know. I'm not clear on that. To me, if I had to give a judgment, the answer to that would be no. And the most critical variable remains the foreign exchange variable, how we handle that. Talking about and saying, for example, as is reported on the news today, that we import $1 billion in cereal and so on and so forth. Well, that's indicative. Some percentage of that $1 billion imports is re-exported in the form of cereal. In other words, we have at least one cereal company that exports cereals. I don't know if that was an indirect attack on the cereal company, right? But that's something to be considered. So the real question is, housing. If that expands, does it give a little fillip to the market? Yes. It basically increases the amount of labor that is available. It absorbs unemployment numbers. Therefore, it reduces unemployment numbers and help to keep the demand buoyant, or at least prevent it from going downwards. So that's the construction sector. That's what we want to do. With regard to the ease of doing business and all those other things, those things are going to take time. So the reality is that we're going to have between 3 to 5 years of tough work if we do the basics which are necessary to improve the various sectors that are capable of export. Exactly how things pan out in the energy sector, well, that depends upon external market forces and the price variables. And that also says, how are we going to recover? What does the IMF say about the world market conditions? They expect the recovery to be positive, but slow. In fact, the word that was used by the IMF managing director is multi-year recovery. Multi-year recovery. In other words, it's not going to recover in 1 year. It's not going to recover in 2. So we're looking at expanding our horizon so that Trinidad is going to be in a situation where demand is likely to be level. We're not going to see any great increases in business over the next 2 to 3 years. And a lot depends upon what takes place in the energy sector, because all the other sectors that we speak about absorb US dollars. They don't generate US dollars. And that's going to be the most significant variable moving forward. So that is really where I would like to leave it. And I will take any questions that you may have moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mariano Brown, for that insight. I would like to open the floor for questions. Please mute your mics, the audience, once members are making have questions, or you can send your questions to the chat box. I have a question from the chat box to Mr. Ramnarine. Question, Mr. Ramnarine. We have a Democratic candidate of the United States of America, Joe Biden, stating that under his government, he will cease oil and gas drilling. How will this impact Trinidad and Tobago? Yannick Duff. Question from Yannick Duff.
My broad answer to that is that if the Democrats win the election in 3 weeks' time or 2 weeks' time, I expect oil prices to increase, because the signal would be, because they are more in favor, the Democratic Party is more in favor of banning fracking, which is the source, which is how America produces about half its oil now from shale. I haven't heard Biden be very firm on this. One of the other presidential candidates, I forget her name now.
Ms. Kamala Harris?
No. Mr. Trump calls her Pocahontas. Elizabeth Warren.
Warren, yes.
Elizabeth Warren, yeah. Elizabeth Warren had categorically stated that if she became president from day one, she was going to ban fracking. Biden hasn't been that fundamentalist about it, but Trump is clearly pro-American energy independence, and he is pro oil and gas in the US. So I think that if the Democrats were to win, there will be a signal sent to the market that there might be a clampdown on fracking, or it might be more difficult to get permits to drill wells which require fracking. And as a result, America's oil production would begin to decline and oil prices would begin to go up. So if Trump wins, I expect the shale industry to continue its post-COVID recovery.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ramnarine. Another question to the panel. How many years do you estimate our stock of foreign exchange reserves to last us at the current rate of depletion? Alicia Nanku. Question posed to the panel. Dr. Hussain? Your mic is muted, sir.
5 years.
6 billion. So let me check. Good. Thanks for the question. We have about 7 billion in foreign exchange, but part of that foreign exchange, let's be clear, is money we borrowed and money from the HSF. So really, I think, Kevin and Mariano, that our stock of foreign exchange has, excluding the HSF and excluding the borrowing, is probably 5 point something, and we need to be careful about that. It means that we move from about 11.4 billion in 2014 to 6 billion less now. And the student asks if it is, what is the implications for our stock of foreign exchange as we move forward? Well, Kevin just mentioned about 4 to 5 projects, even 6 that could come on stream in between 2021 and 2023, let's see. Now there's about a 14% fall off in natural gas production every year. And Kevin showed a clear correlation between, I think he used hydrocarbon output, but I would specifically say natural gas production and real GDP of 98%. So once you could get natural gas production, or except that in the last 3 years, there was a little bit of decoupling to 77%, but once you can get natural gas production increasing, which is where touchstone comes in so importantly, and which is where Kevin should take a bow, in that we expect that the medium term would see some improvement in GDP and some improvement in GDP because the energy sector would realize some improvement in output. But that relationship, as I said, is not like it was, Davidson, before 2016. Since 2016, something went wrong or something emerged in the relationship between natural gas production and real GDP that changed the correlation from about 98% to about 77% now. I haven't had the time to look at it as strongly as I want, but I suspect it is because we became more drawers of water and hewers of wood, so that more of our natural gas went towards LNG, which has less processing and less backward and forward linkage on the petrochemical plants at Point Research. So I suspect that is the answer. But I don't think the foreign exchange situation is falling off a cliff, although it may be falling off a slope that's fairly bad, but not necessarily off a 90 degrees cliff. What we would need to do is, as we adapt and adopt fiscal measures, we should have a clear impression one by one in how it would impact on the non-energy export position. You know, it's almost like saying, Davidson, how are you? How are you going today? What are you doing for export revenues? That's the way I see the foreign exchange situation. And so it won't fall off a cliff immediately, but we are on a terrible slope. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Just, yeah, sure, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the IMF in its 2018 outlook had indicated that for Trinidad and Tobago in its final report on the Article 4 consultation had indicated that 2023 would be the year in which we will start having difficulties. Now, I want to say that when the reserves start getting lower, it doesn't leak out at the same rate. The acceleration increases. The leak increases in acceleration. Now, what the Minister of Finance has been banking on has been that using the HSF as a backstop. Now, if you take the fact that we've drawn down, if you only take the foreign exchange borrowings out of it and the fact that we have to repay them, you will say that the reserves at $5 billion US net reserves, and I think that's the number we have to work with, net reserves, because it's the 7 billion minus the 2 billion that we borrowed that we have to repay over time. So if you take that as a net position, and you deduct from that your drawdowns from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, you realize from your earnings, what you've been earning for foreign exchange, the real foreign exchange position is a lot lower. It is at $5 billion precisely because we've been drawing out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. That is what has helped us out. So I am not so clear that we have a heck of a lot of time. All right, we need to have some sort of change around in our net trade position pretty damn quick. And I think that 2023, when the IMF's original estimate remains the targeted year. I think the minister's statement that we have reserves for so many time for 25 years, I think is the number that he used, and that we've been able to defend the peg. I think that's rubbish.
Okay. All right, just a follow-up question. What can the government do to save foreign exchange expenditure in the country? That's the follow-up.
Well, you know, markets are about pricing. It's about when the price goes up, less people buy, unless of course there's a very inelastic demand. But generally speaking, that when prices change, it affects the demand, the elasticity of demand. And that's a decision that we've been avoiding for quite some time. I think we're going to find ourselves in a situation, the longer you take to allow the market forces to work in that area, the worse it becomes. And I don't think that short of that, we could talk about all the other things in terms of saving foreign exchange. And those avenues have to be explored. They have to be explored. We have to use as little foreign exchange as possible for consumption purposes, and as much of foreign exchange as we can for productive purposes. But if you're going, for example, you're going to stimulate the construction sector, and if there is anybody in the audience who are contractors, they would understand that between 50 and 60% of their building costs are in terms of finishes, all of which are imported. So if you kickstart a construction boom as part of helping, if you want, increase demand, you are also going to cause a more rapid deceleration in terms of your loss of foreign exchange. So this is a very difficult situation. In my mind, the government has 18 months to tidy things up. I don't think we can continue in this sort of stage of stasis for more than 18 months.
So
Okay.
let me add to that, if I may, President. So certainly at some point in time, and this government in particular seems very trigger shy of devaluing the currency, and they would have their reasons. We just hope we don't end up in a situation as in the 1980s where all the foreign exchange reserves disappear, and then we are. But you know, I have raised in the public domain proper and more appropriate use of the Venezuelan workers. And of course, it's now a more troubling scenario with COVID, and therefore some of our own nationals need to be employed. But the Venezuelans do represent a factor of production boom, labor. That and we see them employed all over the place. Let's not fool ourselves. The Venezuelans are here, and they are taking up a lot of the jobs that the Trinidad and Tobago nationals refused in the past. And so whereas in the past it was complementary, now it's probably a little more substituting. But we have to look at that. And, you know, in all fairness to the government, they spoke about the special economic zone where you could get some foreign exchange generated under the conditions there if we have the right type of firms. And they also put out a ban on the imports of certain kind of cars and whatnot. That's good. We need to continue with those type of import bans and the bans on certain type of luxury items. I support those things. We have no money, so what would we do? We have to stop the imports of certain things. And if, however, we could get the incentive structure right for the e-tech parks related to the special economic zone, we could get this ball moving a bit more. And certainly if as the economy picks up, we take the Venezuelans and make better use of them under a structured labor market program that puts them either in the import substituting sector or the export revenue earning sector. Even if it's agriculture, we will get the ball going exactly in the direction we want. The problem is we have this type of approach where we say 6 of one thing and then half a dozen of another. And I use the agricultural program, for example. We pumped 500 million into agriculture. That's good. It would create some incentive. It would reduce the cost of production. It would encourage production in certain areas that we are marginal in, and so on. But then at the same point in time, Davidson, you put out $400 million for CPEP. Why not run a farm PEP and send them to work in the agricultural sector so everything is moving in the same direction? What you have is something like this. And then there is a tension in the economy where part of the relevant local economic labor force, so I am excluding the Venezuelans, that could be used for productive purposes in the agricultural sector are almost being driven and encouraged by a higher effective wage rate out of the agricultural sector. And I know I see I will comment about 850 to 1 US, which you would have raised last year. And he is very correct. The only thing I would say is that we have a route that could complement that. We are having, and I'm guessing here, about 70,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad. And I see new ones every day. I live in Gasparilla, where I interact with the Venezuelans when they pass, and you would see one come, and then you would see their wife, and then you would see their mother-in-law, and then you would see their cousin, and it keeps expanding. So we need to stem the inflow, and we need to make more productive use of those who are here. And you would, if you do the analysis, you would find that a proper deployment of the Venezuelan labor force in the right form is equal to devaluation in most regards, analytically. So I would just add that little piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain, and to the panelists for enlightening us on that first round of questions. Dr. Hussain, I just want to take off from where you left in terms of the incentive structure and direct the conversation a little bit more, not just to the debates which have started over the last couple days on the budget, but also take a look back at the Road to Recovery document. And I want to ask each panelist to comment on whether or not in their respective fields that whether or not they see any kind of congruence or consistency in terms of the investment made in the Road to Recovery document and the stepwise fashion that the budget should have taken, given that it's one of those tools of public policy.
Yeah. So let me go first because I will be short. The budget is a very good reflection of what was said in the Economic Recovery Roadmap 2 document. The problem is implementation. So remember, you could come into that budget and say anything, you know, you could say alpha is equal to beta, you could say you saw a fish on a tree, you could say a lot of things. But the problem is in implementation. So in my view, it's very, very much aligned is whether or not there would be an actualization of what was said. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Hussain. Mr. Ramnarine, Mr. Brown, would you guys like to comment on this?
I would
go ahead, Mariano. Looking for the Road to Recovery document here online.
Look, the Road to Recovery document, and I think recognizes that there are things which have to be done in the short term. And that there should be some degree of expansion. But the Road to Recovery document also says that there are a number of areas that have to be fixed. So Roger's point about implementation is an important one. But if you listen to what was said in the budget speech, so many things were said. I mean, the government is going to move post haste to improve the ease of doing business. We're going to institute a registry system. But if there are anybody in the audience who are part of the attorneys that deal with the registration of land, they will come to the conclusion that what the government has said in the budget speech, and in terms of the interim steps which have been made immediately after the budget speech, have done nothing to address that. So I think that the budget is an important statement, but I think that the minister made certain that he said all the right things, but I don't think he really means to do any of them. I think that would be my point. So I think we have to we have to ride out this COVID stage until the economy reopens. We've gone through bits and pieces of that. We are watching all over the world where some of them have opened up to basically go back to lockdown measures, to go back to open up measures. At some stage of the game, we have to come to the conclusion that we're going to have to keep the economies open if people, if the economies that will survive and to recover. Otherwise, the recovery stage is going to be a lot longer and a lot more difficult, and there's going to be a lot more pain in the fallout, and which the recovery document also recognizes. It recognizes that government cannot run an expansionary fiscal position forever, and that there are certain measures that have to be followed.
Great. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Mr. Brown.
Right. Let me just, so I have the Road to Recovery document. I wanted to get the actual document so I could read from it. So in the document, in the very early part of the document, of course, there is introduction and context on page 1, and that lasts until page 4. And on page 5, the committee comes with their recommendations up front. And they say the number 1 recommendation, well, I don't know if it's number 1 or if it just happened to be there, but it's the first recommendation, is that we have to have an acceleration of measures to enhance revenues in the short term. And they go on to say, in this respect, consideration must be given to urgent enhancement of the gas value chain, recalibration to optimize gas and commodity output in the short term. Targeted revenue can be set at $2 billion. I don't know how they arrive at that. But I think it being the first recommendation shows that the urgency of what was happening or what is happening in Point Lisas would have, of course, played some role in the thinking that went into this being the first recommendation. So I think the language here is very vague, and I don't know what that means, recalibration to optimize and so on. The bottom line is that no matter how you turn this problem and you look at the Rubik's Cube, I like to call it, there is one solution to the problem in Point Lisas, which is that we have to lower the price of natural gas that those plants in Point Lisas are buying. Because the price of methanol and ammonia on the world market we have no control over that. What we have control over is the price that the plants in Point Lisas pay, and we have control over our ability to attract investment into exploration and production. So it all comes back to, at the end of the day, it all comes back to increasing natural gas production and producing natural gas or delivering natural gas to Point Lisas at a lower price. That is what, all these very complex discussions and road to recovery and so on, it boils down to that, in my opinion. So I concur with Roger and Mariano. And Mariano and I have been part of 2 different cabinets in the past. If you go back to all the budget speeches of the last 20 years, there's always a gap between what the Minister of Finance says and what actually gets done. So, and again, we come back to this whole problem of implementation in Trinidad. So I'll leave that there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Ramnarine, Mr. Brown and Dr. Hussain. 2 specific questions that I want to direct to Mr. Brown, and they are coming from the audience. In particular, whether or not this push to digitize the TNT economy is going to enable us to reach or entrench the 4th industrial revolution locally. That's 1. And 2, whether or not we're expecting any kind of instability at the financial institutions in terms of their financing of real estate as compared to non-core activities. To Mr. Ramnarine, a question from the audience as well, with millennials not really making long-term careers in oil and gas, and maybe this is because of the volatility in the sector, how can we continue to hang on to this for revenue even to our demise, it seems, and how do we set up for the future direction of TNT, understanding that our energy sector is what I think Dr. Hussein would call it a sunset industry. And the last question I am going to ask to Dr. Hussein is to develop some of the opportunities, not just locally, but rather at the regional sector, at the regional level that TNT should be considering in terms of diversification.
Can I take the one with the banking sector first?
You can, yes, you can, Mr. Brown.
Yes, okay, good. Well, the answer to that is provided by the Financial Stability Report, which the IMF issued with respect to Trinidad and Tobago last week. It did indicate that whilst the banking sector was well capitalized and had adequate reserves, that the continuing difficulties in the economy will eventually begin to affect loan portfolios. And by affecting the loan portfolios, could affect the stability of the banking sector. Now, let me just say that we've had, Trinidad has gone through sort of two economic fallouts, more or less all in one period, with the financial sector. That started in, you could say, started before the decline, with the demise of what we consider to be a non-bank financial intermediaries who were very exposed to the property market. And we made some tightening adjustments and so on. Those tightening adjustments have worked generally. And we have adopted the BAL Accords in full. Now, I think that the banks have already started to tighten up their portfolios. And you would have seen that, particularly those of you who have been borrowing from the banks would see that the banks have already gotten, their risk appetite for real estate development has declined. They are only lending to customers who could demonstrate that they have cash flow and or who have significant real assets where the realizable value is sufficient to be able to cover it. So the banks have already started to take defensive measures to take that into to take those things into consideration. That's one of the reasons why, notwithstanding the amount of liquidity in the system, the credit to the business sector hasn't been going up significantly. And that's because the banks have become risk averse. And in those circumstances, I expect them to become more risk averse, not less. So that's my answer to that. So the banking sector, yes, the banking sector could be at risk, but the banks have already started to take defensive measures where that is concerned. In the second point with regard to digitization, let me just say that we really have not adopted a fulsome approach to the issue of digitization. If there is one ministry or two that could make a difference, I will point out to the Ministry of Trade insofar as it has carried the concept of a one-stop shop, which was started since we've talked about it since the 70s, where the Ministry of Trade and Industry instituted what we call TT BizLink, which also front ends the Ministry of Legal Affairs registration system. Unfortunately, and you could see it in terms of the US State Department evaluation of Trinidad and Tobago as an investment destination, they referred to all the external evaluations of Trinidad and Tobago's digital capacity. And the evaluation of our digital capacity with respect to, certainly with regard to Trinidad BizLink, we were scaled on out of 10. And the figure that we got was 3.5. If we look at the ease of doing business, and one of the key measures, if you want to talk about digitization, should be the ease of making payments online to settle government business. To the extent that government makes those changes quickly, you would find that the rest of the economy will fall in line. There are people that are doing it. So for example, you could pay a TSTT bill online, you can pay a flow bill online, and a few others. But generally speaking, that has not gone as far as it should. And in the ease of doing business, certainly, for example, in terms of your ability to pay your taxes, whereas Trinidad and Tobago we ranked 160 out of 190 countries on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index on the basis of paying your taxes. In 2020, we rank at 166. In other words, you didn't improve. So notwithstanding the conversation or the talk about digitization and or transforming ourselves in terms of a new electronic environment, we are way behind the 8 ball in terms of getting on with those things. And it doesn't happen overnight. A good example of that would be the procurement methodologies. The procurement methodologies anticipate in the new Procurement Act for government, anticipate that this will all be done electronically. And the government did, certainly under the time I was in office, we tested it on several different occasions. Have we moved to a stable platform where we could do this on an ongoing basis? The answer to that is no, we're not ready. So that there are lots of steps that have to be taken for us to get to that position. And it has yet to be seen. I mean, just taking into consideration at the moment, for example, teaching online for our schools, our primary schools and our secondary schools. Well, there's some things you could put online, and there's some things that just don't work online. Teaching children under the age of 15 and 16 in a classroom environment where you are actually trying to replicate a normal classroom does not work. And if you just use that as a metaphor, well, there are lots of stuff that we have to do.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Ramnarine or Dr. Hussain, you guys want to take the next round of questions?
What is the question? The question was the sunset industry question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree. Oil is a sunset industry, but nobody knows exactly when the sun is going to set. But we know the sun will set. I expect that when I depart this earth, which might be in the next 100 years, right?
Yes, hoping,
with advances in medical technology and so on. I expect that by, if we were to go into the future in the year 2050, mankind will still be using oil. And the reason for that is that there are certain industrial processes that require very high temperatures. And you can't get that kind of thing from renewable energy. But what will happen is that as we progress in the next 30 years, renewable energy's share of the energy diet of the world is certainly going to increase. So oil and gas is not going to go away tomorrow. In fact, there is an even stronger argument for natural gas because it's so much cleaner, less carbon intensive, and certainly very abundant. The world has, for example, it's estimated the world has about 200 years of natural gas. So if you're considering a career in oil and gas, I would say go for it. If you go to Guyana, everybody wants to study oil and gas, right? So the industry is going to be around for a while. But I think that probably by the latter part of this decade, we would have achieved what I call peak oil demand, and then demand for oil should gradually fall. But it's not going to go away, suddenly. It's going to be around for a while.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Ramnarine. Dr. Hussain.
So Rebecca, in relation to the question on the Caribbean Economic Zone, I think there are tremendous opportunity for production activity in Trinidad to benefit from the markets of Guyana and Suriname. Those are tremendous markets that would be on the upswing of economic growth in the next 15 years, probably consecutive growth. And COVID will come under control at some point in time, even 12 months, 18 months, it would get under control. And those markets are going to become bigger and bigger. And Trinidad and Tobago manufacturers have to get on board with those markets. And, I recently designed the medium-term strategic plan for the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturing Association. 3-year plan. Rebecca, you worked on that with me, and the manufacturers, we framed out a clear roadmap to double manufacture and export by 2025. And they are going at it. They have set well-defined KPIs. They have a plan. They have been communicated with their membership. Some of them are probably on this chat. And they are going at it. And we have been asked to do some small follow-up with them. And we are seeing a determined effort. In fact, sometimes I think that if the government were to just come out of the way and let the business people run some of these things and fix the ease of doing business and make the road clear, rather than put it up a set of traffic light and a set of roadblock every 5 minutes, then the business people would go their way and get their things done. So those are some good markets, and I think that there is good value in focusing our efforts on the Caribbean as a stepping stone to larger markets. In fact, Sarata Lewis said that the Caribbean zone should be used as a launching pad. The challenge is always when firms want to become comfortable at the Caribbean level, but I can tell you, even right now, we will take that because foreign exchange is foreign exchange, regardless if it comes from Brazil, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, Mozambique, or the USA. We will take it where we get it from right now. So
Great.
That's my response.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to open up the floor for a final round of questions. You can either send your questions via the chat medium, or if you prefer, you can unmute your mic and speak to the panelists directly.
Hi, good night. Dr. Hussain, one question. Do you foresee the government going to the IMF, given the economic harshness surrounding COVID? Is that something might happen or not?
So let us take the three questions, or the round of questions, one all and one Rebecca, so
Sure.
Each one will get a flowing comment, please.
Sure, thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? If not, I do have a question for Mr. Ramnarine, and this is regarding the deregularization of the gas markets in Trinidad and Tobago. What are some of the expectations for the average consumer on the ground in terms of prices, in terms of availability of gas? What are some of the things that we need to prepare ourselves for, given that this is the direction that the government is going? And a question for Mr. Brown. The minister highlighted that the Revenue Authority was being fast-tracked. Do you foresee that the Revenue Authority would be more efficiently operated than the Board of Inland Revenue, for example? And we have a final question from our audience that has been put in via the chat. And this, Dr. Hussain, we can go back to you with this question. Would you devalue the currency now to try to curb the usage of foreign reserves and encourage local manufacturing? So Davidson, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So we can now leave the floor open for Dr. Hussain to. Yeah.
So thank you,
Yeah.
Davidson, for your question, and Rebecca. So at some point in time, if matters continue as they are, we would need to be to take more acute measures to fix the economy. The government has adopted the approach that they can do it themselves, and there was a turnaround in the 2018 economic growth performance based upon the numbers we saw announced in the review of the economy 2020. From it moved to 0.2 from minus 0.2, and that's something that puzzles me, and I suspect that number will change again as we move forward. The point being that the current measures are not really working as we would like. and that we would need to support what we are doing with stronger fiscal measures. Having said that, the COVID-19 situation has tightened the economy and made it really difficult to make sharp decisions as we would like. Although the Prime Minister recently, and I give him credit for that, say, well, if you don't work, you can't get no money. And how you get money if you don't want to work? And what we need to do is, we cannot see the IMF as a bogeyman. The IMF was here, and the IMF under, and I'm not sure if Mariano was in office then, but in 1993, we floated the dollar as part of an IMF follow-up package. And the economy experienced some of the best growth performance that it had until 2008. There were other factors, but we did float the dollar, and we did, in the process of floating the dollar, experience a devaluation. I think it was a 25% devaluation. The point is that there is scope for support, be it from the IMF, the IDB, on structural reform. And unless we engage in structural reform, like I see they have made changes on NP. Kevin is the authority and that will comment. But to me, getting rid of Petroleum was a good thing and privatize it. If NP is too top heavy and its model of governing the retail petroleum sector involves too much markups and too high wages for a block of people with a militant union, and if it is, you deregularize and you make it less cumbersome and you open the market up for competition, if that would improve outcomes, then so be it. What we need is a dose of reality. We cannot afford all these transfers and subsidies. We cannot afford this gimme mentality. And either we fix it ourselves or we go to the IMF or some other entity, but it needs to be fixed. So whilst I don't want to bluntly say we should go to the IMF, I am saying that the structural impediments to development, they have to be removed by one way or the other, be it the IMF or otherwise. Except that, and the only caution I would add, is in the 1980s, we took our time to go to the IMF, and we ended up moving from a position of foreign exchange surplus to a deficit on the foreign exchange account. And I don't know that we want to go there again. Thank you.
Just by way of just to correct Roger, the floating of the foreign exchange had nothing to do with the IMF in 1993. That was a political decision. It had nothing to do with the IMF or continuation of an IMF program. And I could say that with some degree of certainty, in as much as I was involved in it. With respect to, just to go back on the other one, remind me what you wanted me to speak on specifically. Mine went off there.
Mr. Brown, so basically I asked whether or not the Revenue Authority is likely to be more operationally efficient than BIR? Mr. Brown?
It seems to have.
Okay, well, we can move on to Mr. Ramnarine's comments.
Okay,
Yeah.
we lost Mariano there.
Yeah, we lost him.
It
All right,
seems
okay.
so.
All right. Well, let me just talk about this fuel subsidy issue. It's a very important issue. I think it's one of the biggest changes in direction that has been made under this Minister of Finance. He has taken very bold steps to reform this fuel subsidy. We have spent $38 billion subsidizing fuel in the 21st century, from the year 2000 to the year 2019. That is a very significant amount of money. That is more money than the country earned in 2019. So $38 billion could have done a lot of things other than subsidize fuel. So the subsidy on fuel is really a legacy of 1974. in 1974, in 1973, flowing into 1974, international oil prices quadrupled. And that meant two things for Trinidad and Tobago. It meant, one, that we were earning a lot more money from the oil industry, but it also meant that the citizens were exposed to higher prices at the pump. So the government introduced in 1974 a subsidy on fuel, where the price at the pump was regulated and the government would pay the excess. In 1974, when the law was being piloted in Parliament, I've gone back and I've had the Parliament staff get the Hansard for me from 1974 because I wanted to see what was the thinking of the parliamentarians at the time. And one of the independent senators back then, Mr. Tommy Gatliff, who was a well-known businessman in Trinidad and Tobago, he cautioned the government, specifically at the time, George Chambers, who was Minister of Finance, he cautioned that this thing could become a runaway train. The government said, we recognize the risk of it becoming this, of it snowballing, and we are going to take steps to monitor this subsidy on a regular basis to ensure that your concerns are, taken into consideration. Of course, the rest is history. It did become a runaway train. And the subsidy is, so I just gave it a 38 billion figure. So what has happened now is that the subsidy has been, when I was Minister of Energy, the subsidy at some points in time averaged between $4 to $5 billion a year. We're talking about the years 2012, 2013, 2014. So when the government changed in 2015, the current Minister of Finance started to increase the price at the pump. At the same time, while he was increasing the price at the pump, the price of oil on the world market was coming down. So the effect of those two things meant that the subsidy came down to almost $270 million in 2019. So from a high of $4 to $5 billion in 2013, 2014, down to 300. Subsidy was effectively almost gone. It is my view that this is a step in the right direction for Trinidad. If we allow gas station owners to set their price, then what we will have is a reduction in the price of super. Because at $4.97 per liter, which is what we all pay for super gasoline is the government, and at $40 a barrel, there will be a surplus on super. There would be a slight subsidy on diesel. So my thinking is that if you allow the market to determine the price, given the current world oil prices, then you should see a reduction in fuel at the pump come January, assuming everything stays as is. And I expect oil prices not to go too far beyond $50 a barrel. Maybe it might go to 51 or 52 and so on. But most thinking is that it will stay in this band between 40 to 50 for a while. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that we are going to become like the US, where people will be looking around, shopping around, people might develop apps. I could foresee that happening in Trinidad. People will have somebody who might develop an app, or you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, Mono Road flyover, I could get super for $3.50 per liter. And I could get super by Brentwood for $3.60. I go in Mono Road flyover. I think it will also breed competition into the market, right? The other leg of what the minister did was he announced the privatization or the sale, the divestment of NP's service stations. I think NP directly owns about 65 stations. The rest of NP stations are what they call dealer-owned, dealer-operated stations, which are owned by private individuals but the stations carry the NP flag or the NP brand. So again, I think there's a lot of fear, and this is the thing about Trinidad and Tobago. Change is always accompanied by fear. You know, the world will end, right? If we deregulate the fuel sector, fuel prices will go out of control, and people will form cartels and so on. I really don't think that will happen. I think what will happen is that we may end up with a more dynamic fuel sector in Trinidad. I would have gone a step further, and I would have deregulated the importation of fuel, because right now we only have one company in Trinidad importing fuel, Paria. Should something go wrong with Paria, should they have a problem with the jetty, a problem with the pipelines or the tanks, then the whole country is compromised. So I would have gone a step further, and I would have allowed the private sector, anybody interested in the private sector who has capital and who's willing to take the risk and who may have the land and want to build the tanks and so on, let the private sector import fuel too. In terms of some of the concerns that I have, a deregulated market will clearly favor the larger gas stations, because those large stations have quick shops. I mean, take a look at the quick shop on Monroe Road flyover. Take a look at the quick shop at St. Christopher's. Take a look at the quick shop in Peaks. Those quick shops account for, depending on who you talk to, those quick shops could be 50% of the revenue of a gas station. And of course, what could happen is that the quick shop, the gas stations with the quick shop, those gas station owners now could decide that they will sell fuel cheaper and use the quick shop to sort of lower the price at the pump to draw people into the station and into the quick shop. So that will mean that those larger stations will have that advantage over the smaller stations. And the other concern I had, which I see the Minister of Energy has addressed, is fuel supply to Tobago. And he said that because the cost of fuel in Tobago right now is the same as the cost of fuel in Trinidad, which means that there's some subsidy there because fuel has to be shipped to Tobago. That cost is currently absorbed by NP. So the minister said that the NP will continue to absorb that cost. If we allow a complete free market to operate, then the cost of fuel in Tobago would be significantly more than the cost in Trinidad, because you have the shipping costs associated with Tobago. So I suppose for now, Tobago has to sort of be sheltered from the full effect of the deregulation. But I think it's a step in the right direction. And I checked with Barbados, I checked with Jamaica. In those countries, the gas station or the service station network is all privately owned. And I mean, some of us who have traveled around the Caribbean, I mean, if you go to Guyana, Guyana has some nicer gas stations than anything we could see in Trinidad, because, they have Sol and Rubis and so on. Same applies in Barbados, So I say it will breed some dynamism into the sector, and let's see how the private sector reacts to it. Already, I have gotten a lot of calls from businessmen inquiring about buying gas stations, So I told them it's still very early. I'm told NP is still in the very preliminary stages of discussing this with the government as to how this will be rolled out and so on. So it will take some time, but I think it's a step in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ramnarine. Mr. Brown, did you rejoin us? I understood you were having some technical difficulties. Mr. Brown.
I'm not seeing him.
Yes. I did have some technical.
Yes, hi.
The question that I was supposed to answer had to do with the TTRA. All right, let's put it this way.
The Revenue Authority, yes.
Right. Let's put it this way. Yeah, we have to be careful of the single story. The single story means that if we put all our hopes on one thing, that one thing will come And when it happens, it will magically wave a new wand and everything else will be right. The people who are going to go into the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority are the same people who are currently in Inland Revenue. What the TTRA does is create an independent association, effectively an independent organization, which technically should be run on more firm management principles. And the organization should be responsible for itself. It has worked in other countries. Barbados, for example, has a revenue authority, and they have made some adjustments. So to all intents and purposes, it can work, it should work, it ought to work. But for it to become more efficient, they have to have a lot of changes in terms of the underlying practices that are currently used or alternatively not used by inland revenue. And it also has to step up to the plate in more senses than one. So that requires a number of changes, all of them administrative. And where are the new people who are going to bring these this new thinking into being, if you're going to staff it entirely with staff that has come from inside of the inland revenue? To have a new organization come, it must also have a new leader. It must have a difference in terms of the timing, the tone, the tempo, in terms of how it operates. So I think in terms of administrative change, Trinidad and Tobago has not done well by changing the names of institutions and asking them to do the things that they did before. The classic example for that is HCC, which is the newly incorporated entity, which is supposed to leave all the ills of the NHA behind. It hasn't. Now take that institutional lessening position, and I have to say that the devil is in the details and how we manage that process. I don't see anything that fills me with a great degree of optimism moving forward.
Mr. Brown, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for spending the evening with us. At this time, I want to just give our panelists the opportunity, Mr. Brown and Mr. Ramnarine, if they want to have any closing comments, to offer those now. Mr. Brown.
On my part, the point I would make is that I think the budget speech promised a lot. I don't think it's going to deliver. We are in the same position today as we were in 2015, except that we have lost 5 years. If we have to address the situation, it has to be addressed in a more direct manner than we have done so. And the transmission process is going to be foreign exchange. We do not need to devalue. There is a mechanism. We have a floating exchange rate, and the floating exchange rate ought to be allowed to work. The reason why it hasn't, and we have this inbuilt tension in the system, is precisely because we are frustrating it's the way it works. So it hasn't. So I think that's a fairly simple decision. I don't think it requires the IMF. I think one of the members of the recovery committee put it well, that you do not necessarily have to go to the IMF to take measures. You have to be prepared to have the political will to make those decisions known and followed on your own. And Trinidad is still in that position. So I don't buy the IMF bogeyman. This is about making decisions about where we want to carry Trinidad and Tobago, and those decisions, unfortunately, have been avoided.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Mr. Ramnarine, any closing comments?
My closing comment would be that our economy is too state-centric. We need to take a page out of the Jamaicans, and we need to have the private sector playing a much larger role in the economy. And secondly, I would aggressively, if I were in the government today, I would aggressively address ease of doing business. And those are two things, put the private sector in front and make it easier to do business in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramnarine. I want to thank my co-host and representative from the Rotary Club of Pointe-a-Pierre, Mr. Davidson Lalu. It was definitely a pleasure to engage with the Rotary Club, and we are looking forward from shore to continue the engagement. Would you like to offer any closing comments on behalf of the association before I hand over to Dr. Hussain?
Thank you very much, Ms. Gookool-Bosland. I am very grateful for the opportunity to co-host with you tonight. I'm also thanking Mr. Mariano Brown, Dr. Roger Hussain, and Mr. Kevin Ramnarine from the Rotary Club of Pointe-a-Pierre. It was indeed an enlightening conversation tonight. I think we actually reached a place where we can discuss it virtually. This is some of the technology that is afforded to us now, and you can get that one-on-one experience. So with all gratefulness, we thank you for being a part of the presentation tonight and allowing us to have you as our guest. Thank you. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Pointe-a-Pierre, I now move over to Dr. Roger Hussain. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You know, the dialogue is far from complete. The situation is one that requires civil society to play an even deeper role in the next 5 years. You know, institutions like the Rotary Club and Shore Foundation, definitely, when you look at the micro numbers, it's a new normal. In fact, it's almost a good opportunity to reinvent what Rotary does and to reinvent what Shore Foundation and other CSO does, because in 5 years, we have had an 18% contraction in GDP. And the level of unemployment, the unemployment rate as we speak now, if I am to use some of the numbers that is being bandied about, is one of the worst since 1956. So that cannot be the same type of intervention we would have used, Davidson, in 2019. So, you know, we go out to the public, we give some hampers, we help some people, we buy a wheelchair, we buy a crutch. Those are normal standardized interventions that a lot of good institutions and good people do. But we are talking about a sharp change in the environment in which we subsist, in which 100,000 people thereabout in the entertainment sector is out of work, and a great proportion of other workers are underemployed. And therefore, it's a time to reflect. And I say this publicly to all the civil society groups on what is now needed from civil society groups in this new normal or in this abnormal normal. And we need to think that through, and certainly conversations like these are fertile breeding ground to give ideas of the right calibration to the situation to help address the problem. So I would close there, and you know, as I straddle both entities, I say it's really good working with these type of groups for the betterment of our country. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, Dr. Hussain, and to the rest of the panel. To all of our audience, please stay safe, wear a mask, and do look out for our correspondences on other conversations that are coming up. As Dr. Hussain said, this is a responsibility that our institutions take deliberately, and we feel honored that you have allowed us this time this evening. So to everyone, have a pleasant evening and good night.
Thank you. Great to have you.